The night sky over the Gulf of Aden was unusually silent, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. Far beyond the horizon, the USS Eisenhower carrier strike group cut through the dark waters like a moving city of steel, its flight deck glowing with the cold blue lights of night operations. The world believed this was just another routine patrol, another defensive stance in a region where tensions had been rising for months. But deep inside the carrier's combat direction center, the United States Navy was preparing something far more decisive, something that would soon shake the region and send shockwaves across global security networks. For weeks, intelligence had been pouring in from drones, satellites, and electronic intercepts pointing to one chilling fact. A major Houthi operations base on the Yemeni coast had transformed from a ragged militant outpost into a fully armed missile and drone hub. This wasn't just another camp. This was a launch site responsible for repeated attacks on commercial cargo ships, oil tankers, and even U.S. naval vessels in the Red Sea. The Houthi leadership believed they were untouchable, protected by rugged terrain, underground bunkers, and a web of anti-aircraft weapons supplied by Iranian commanders. But they didn't know that the U.S. Navy had just decided that enough was enough. Inside the Eisenhower, Rear Admiral Michael Reeves stood over a holographic map glowing with the outlines of Yemen's coastline. Target markers blinked in red: missile storage bunkers, drone assembly warehouses, radar towers, and command buildings spread across a hidden valley carved into the cliffs of Al Mara. Reeves already understood the implications. This wasn't going to be a warning strike. This was going to be a message, one written in fire, precision, and overwhelming force. At 0200 hours, the final order came down from U.S. Central Command: Operation Iron Dusk, execute. Within minutes, the quiet flight deck erupted into controlled chaos. Navy deck crews wearing color-coded uniforms moved like a perfectly choreographed machine as F/A-18 Super Hornets, EA-18G Growlers, and F-35C strike fighters were armed, fueled, and brought into launch position. The pilots climbed into their cockpits, their helmets locking with the aircraft's advanced targeting systems. Many of them had flown missions over Yemen before, but tonight was different. Tonight, they weren't intercepting drones, they were going after the source. The first aircraft roared down the deck, its afterburners igniting the darkness with blinding fire. One after another, the strike packages launched into the sky, forming a lethal formation that ascended silently into the upper layers of the night. Miles above the ocean, a MQ-9 Reaper drone was already circling near Yemen's coastline, its infrared sensors watching the Houthi base below. The landscape was alive with activity. Fighters patrolled with rifles slung over their shoulders, mechanics worked under the dim glow of lanterns, and the silhouettes of missile launchers crawled across the sand like steel insects preparing for another attack. They had no idea the U.S. Navy was already in the air. At precisely 2:43, the Reaper transmitted the confirmation signal: all targets positive ID. Defenses active. The Houthi base had been preparing to launch another swarm of drones toward shipping lanes by sunrise. They believed their underground bunkers would shield them from any American retaliation. They believed the cliffs around them were natural armor. What they didn't know was the terrifying accuracy of the weapons now streaking through the sky toward them. The first wave of U.S. Navy missiles came from the sea, not the sky. Several hundred miles away, the guided missile destroyer USS gravely opened its vertical launch cells. A thunderous eruption sent Tomahawk cruise missiles soaring into the night, each one riding low above the waves before sharply turning inland toward its programmed coordinates. Their guidance systems locked onto the valley, weaving through the rugged mountains with surgical precision. Down at the Houthi base, a lookout suddenly froze. In the distance, faint streaks of light, barely visible, cut across the stars. At first, he thought it might be meteors. But then the ground began to tremble. A high-pitched whine filled the air, growing louder and louder until it became inescapable. The lookout opened his mouth to shout a warning, but the first tomahawk hit before he could speak. The explosion tore through the main communications hub, shredding metal, concrete, and electronics in a single instant. The shockwave rolled across the valley, knocking fighters to the ground. Within seconds, another missile struck the radar installation, turning it into a fireball that lit the entire mountainside. Alarms blared across the base as fighters scattered for cover, some firing their rifles blindly into the night sky, others scrambling toward vehicles. But it was already too late. The second wave was coming, and this one was from above. The F-35Cs were the first to arrive, descending silently with their stealth profiles nearly invisible to any surviving Houthi radar. The lead pilot watched through his helmet's augmented display as the valley lit up with chaos. He squeezed the trigger, releasing a pair of GBU-53 precision glide bombs. The smart weapons streaked downward, their targeting sensors locking onto the heat signatures of the drone assembly warehouse. The strike was devastating. The warehouse erupted into a massive explosion as fuel, electronics, and assembled drones ignited all at once. Burning fragments rained across the valley. For a moment, it looked like the entire horizon had turned into a sheet of blazing metal. Then came the Super Hornets. Flying in fast and low, they launched a storm of laser-guided bombs and anti-structure munitions. Each impact cracked the earth, sending pillars of smoke into the sky. The Houthi fighters tried to mount a response. A handful of anti-air guns fired wildly, their tracers streaking upward like desperate fingers reaching for the unseen attackers. But the Growlers immediately responded, unleashing powerful electronic jamming waves that blinded the defenses and silenced every radar dish for miles. In the base's underground command bunker, Houthi officers were shouting over one another. The walls shook violently as the bombardment continued above them. Maps fell from the walls, lights flickered, and dust rained from the ceiling. Someone tried to radio for Allied forces further inland, but every frequency was jammed with static. Panic spread as the officers realized they were completely cut off, blind, and surrounded by destruction. Back in the sky, another wave of tomahawks struck the entrance to the underground bunker, collapsing it like a crushed soda can. Above the burning valley, the U.S. strike aircraft formed a wide circle, scanning for any remaining targets. Secondary explosions still rippled across the sand as hidden munitions cooked off, sending fireballs upward like volcanic eruptions. The entire valley looked like it had been split open by the hand of God. And yet, the mission still wasn't over. Several targets remained. Mobile launchers hidden in the cliffs, fuel depots buried under camouflage nets, and a convoy of armored vehicles attempting to escape down a narrow desert road. The Reaper drone picked up the movement instantly, tagging the convoy with infrared markers that appeared in the pilot's helmets like glowing red diamonds. A pair of Navy F-18s broke formation, diving toward the convoy. They released two AGM-65 Maverick missiles. The missiles streaked across the desert and struck the lead and trailing vehicles simultaneously, boxing in the entire convoy. The remains of the vehicles burst into flames as the fighters circled again, leaving nothing behind but burning wreckage and a cloud of black smoke drifting into the night. By now, the once fortified Houthi base was completely unrecognizable. The missile bunkers were gone, the drone factories destroyed, the communications center obliterated, and the command network severed beyond repair. What had taken years to build had been reduced to molten debris in under 20 minutes. Far above the valley, the U.S. Navy aircraft began returning to the carrier group, their mission complete. The pilots could see the glow of fires still burning across the coastline even from miles away, like the afterglow of a distant volcanic eruption. On board the USS Eisenhower, Admiral Reeves received the final status report. Primary, secondary, and tertiary targets neutralized. Base non-operational. No civilian structures affected. 0 U.S. casualties. Reeves closed his eyes for a moment. Not out of celebration, but out of acknowledgement. The strike had been successful. The threat to shipping lanes had been severely crippled. But he also knew the region was unpredictable, and tonight's mission would echo far beyond the deserts of Yemen. Thousands of miles away, intelligence analysts in Washington watched the satellite feed showing the smoking valley. The words transmitted to U.S. command were clear and chilling. The Houthi base has been wiped off the map. The dust had barely settled when the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, casting long shadows across the charred valley. The smoke from the destroyed base rose in thick, twisting columns, blending with the early morning sky like dark ink spilling into water. It was a landscape transformed, not by nature, not by time, but by the overwhelming precision and force of the U.S. Navy. The Houthi fighters who survived the initial strike crawled from the rubble in shock, coughing from the dust, their ears ringing with the aftershocks of explosions that had shattered their world in the span of minutes. For years, they believed this valley was their safe haven, their impenetrable fortress. Now, it was nothing more than a graveyard of twisted metal and shattered concrete. Far above the destruction, the MQ-9 Reaper drone still circled, its sensors sweeping across the remains of the base. The operators sitting thousands of miles away studied every heat signature, every flicker of movement, every truck attempting to flee into the desert. They were emotionless observers, professional, precise, detached, but even they felt the magnitude of what had occurred. This wasn't just another strike. This was a complete decapitation of one of the Houthis' most important operational hubs. The Reaper's camera zoomed in on what had once been the nerve center of the base. Concrete slabs lay scattered like broken playing cards. Steel beams twisted upward like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. A radar dish lay half buried in sand, its frame melted and warped. The electronic warfare that the Houthis relied on had been reduced to useless husks of metal. There was no mistaking it. This base wasn't damaged, it was erased. But the U.S. Navy knew that eliminating a physical base was only one piece of a much larger strategy. A strike this big, this coordinated, this absolutely one-sided, was meant to do something far more important: send a message. A message to the Houthis. A message to their backers. A message to every hostile group watching from afar who believed they could threaten the world's busiest shipping lane without consequences. On the deck of the USS Eisenhower, the atmosphere was combat-focused. Pilots removed their helmets, their faces still carrying the intensity of the mission. Crew members cleared the flight deck and secured the aircraft. In the Combat Direction Center, officers traced the satellite updates coming from CENTCOM. Every screen told the same story: the valley was gone. The threat was gone. The base had never stood a chance. Admiral Reeves reviewed the final battle damage assessment. There were no signs of secondary Houthi command posts nearby, no surviving missile launchers hidden under camouflage, no radar uplinks still standing. It was the kind of clean result military commanders rarely got. And yet Reeves wasn't celebrating. He had been in the Navy long enough to understand that in modern warfare, victories were never absolute. The enemy always adapted, always rebuilt, always looked for new ways to strike back. Tonight's success was only one chapter in a much longer conflict. Far inland from the destroyed base, Houthi leadership held an emergency meeting. Word of the strike had spread through their ranks like wildfire. Fighters whispered about it in hushed tones, stunned that a place they believed invincible had been reduced to ash instantly. The commanders were furious, embarrassed, and confused. Their intelligence networks had failed them. Their drone watchers had failed them. Their air defense posts had failed them. Most of all, their belief that the U.S. would continue showing restraint had failed them. Inside a dimly lit room, high-ranking Houthi officers pounded their fists on a wooden table as they argued. Some blamed Iran for not supplying stronger weapons. Others blamed their own men for being unprepared. But deep down, they all knew the truth: they had pushed too far. Their attacks on global shipping had crossed a line. The world's largest naval force had finally responded, and responded with a level of precision and power they had never imagined. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in Washington, intelligence analysts and military advisors were reviewing the implications of the strike. The destruction of the Houthi base meant more than eliminating weapons, it meant restoring confidence to the global trading system. Every day, billions of dollars worth of goods crossed the Red Sea. Every ship that sailed through those waters was part of an economic lifeline connecting continents. For months, the Houthis had disrupted that lifeline. Insurance costs skyrocketed. Shipping companies rerouted their vessels. Several nations deployed naval escorts to protect their cargo. But with a single decisive strike, the U.S. Navy had shifted the balance. Back in the Gulf of Aden, as the sun climbed higher, the U.S. carrier strike group maintained its steady vigil over the waters. Other ships moved into formation, a guided missile cruiser scanning the sky, destroyers patrolling for ballistic threats, supply ships preparing for routine replenishment. Life aboard the ships returned to its disciplined rhythm, a rhythm forged by decades of experience in some of the world's most dangerous waters. Yet beneath that calm exterior was a sense of focused readiness. Every sailor, every pilot, every officer knew that retaliation was possible. The Houthis were unpredictable. Their connections with regional networks meant they could acquire new drones or missiles at any moment. The carrier group remained fully alert, ready to respond again if needed. Several miles from the destroyed valley, a small team of surviving Houthi fighters attempted to salvage what little equipment they could. They walked through the charred remains of vehicles, stepping over fragments of missile casings and the melted frames of drones. Their boots sank into the blackened sand, still warm from the explosions. Each step echoed with the knowledge that their once powerful base had been reduced to nothing by an enemy they could barely see. The psychological impact of that destruction would linger far longer than the smoke. One fighter knelt beside a half-buried launcher tube, touching it gently with dust-covered fingers. Not long ago, this tube had launched a missile that struck a merchant vessel, forcing the ship to halt and raising global tensions. Now it was nothing more than a relic of failure. The fighter stood up slowly, looking toward the distant coastline where the sea shimmered under the morning sun. He realized that no matter how many drones or missiles they built, the U.S. Navy could tear it all down in minutes. But the story didn't end with destruction. In Washington, as military planners evaluated the strike, discussions shifted toward long-term strategy. The United States didn't just want to destroy bases, it wanted to reduce the Houthis' ability to threaten the world altogether. That meant more surveillance, more patrols, and better coordination with allies in the region. Satellite constellations were tasked with tracking every movement of Houthi missile units. Electronic intelligence aircraft were assigned to monitor communications. Navy ships increased their presence near key shipping lanes. Back on the USS Eisenhower, a group of young sailors stood near the railing of the deck, looking out over the vast ocean. They had heard the distant rumble of aircraft taking off hours earlier. They had seen the pilots return safely. Now they watched the calm waters below them, knowing that beneath that calm lay one of the most strategically important regions on Earth. Some of them were new to the Navy, only months into their service. Others were veterans of multiple deployments. But they had all just taken part in a mission that would be talked about for years. Inside the carrier, pilots met with intelligence officers to review camera footage from the strike. The images were crisp, detailed, unforgiving. They showed missiles threading through mountains with impossible accuracy. They showed bombs striking hidden targets as if guided by invisible hands. They showed the collapse of buildings that had once housed dangerous weapons. The pilots watched silently, their faces illuminated by the glow of the screens. It was one thing to launch a weapon. It was another to see what it had done. As the footage continued, one pilot leaned forward, studying the aftermath closely. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't smiling. He was analyzing every frame, every angle, every moment. Pilots knew what the world often forgot. Precision was not about destruction, it was about control. The ability to eliminate a threat without harming civilians or damaging infrastructure was what separated modern professional militaries from chaotic warfare. What they had done last night was the result of years of training, billions of dollars of technology, and a deep understanding of their responsibility. Meanwhile, the Houthis attempted to broadcast a message to the world, claiming the strike had not affected them, that they would continue launching attacks, that the U.S. Navy had failed. But satellite imagery and ground intelligence told a different story. Their launch capability in that region had been obliterated. Their radar coverage was non-existent. Their drones were gone. Their command network was fractured. Their strongest base had been wiped off the map. By late afternoon, a sandstorm swept across the region, coating the remains of the valley in a blanket of swirling dust. The winds howled through the ruined structures, carrying with them a chilling reminder of how quickly power could shift. The desert was reclaiming what the bombs had broken. Soon, the valley would look less like a battlefield and more like a scar carved into the earth, a scar left by the United States Navy. As night fell again, the valley returned to darkness, but this time there were no fighters, no generators, no glowing lights from drone hangars. Only silence. A silence created not by peace, but by overwhelming force. And aboard the USS Eisenhower, the men and women of the strike group prepared for whatever would come next. They knew this mission had not just changed the battlefield, it had changed the entire balance of power in the Red Sea. The message had been delivered. And the world had heard it. The days that followed the strike were filled with tension across the Middle East. The entire region buzzed with whispers and speculation. News outlets carried grainy satellite images of the destruction, analysts debated the political impact, and naval experts around the world quietly acknowledged what had just happened. The U.S. Navy had demonstrated once again that its reach was absolute. In one night, a network that had terrorized global trade for months had been reduced to ashes. The Houthi leadership tried to control the narrative. Propaganda channels released old footage, pretending that their missile units were still intact, their drones still operational. But the world wasn't fooled. Western intelligence shared new images showing the valley completely flattened, no sign of life, no sign of recovery. Even the tunnels built deep into the cliffs had caved in. There was no hiding the truth, their strongest base had ceased to exist. Inside the Pentagon, the success of Operation Iron Dusk became a case study in modern warfare, the seamless integration of intelligence, precision weapons, in real-time coordination across air, land, sea, and cyber domains. It wasn't just a show of force, it was proof of capability. Every satellite feed, every radar scan, every encrypted communication had been part of a carefully orchestrated symphony that ended in perfect execution. But even in triumph, there was unease. Senior officers knew that victory on the battlefield did not guarantee peace. The Houthis had been hit hard, but not destroyed entirely. They could rebuild, shift their operations deeper inland, or even change their tactics. Iran, their main supplier, would likely respond quietly, funneling more equipment and training through covert routes. The Navy's strike had wiped out one base, but it had also reminded the world how fragile peace could be in a region that had known war for generations. Back in the Gulf of Aden, the USS Eisenhower and her escort ships continued their patrol. The night air carried a faint scent of salt and diesel as the carrier's engines rumbled steadily beneath the stars. On the deck, sailors stood watch, their eyes scanning the black horizon. In the distance, a faint glow from the Yemeni coastline was still visible, the ghostly reminder of the firestorm that had taken place just nights before. Inside the ship, Admiral Reeves sat alone in his cabin, reviewing the mission logs. Every missile launch, every bomb drop, every communication was meticulously recorded. He knew history would judge the operation not only by its effectiveness but by its precision, by how carefully it avoided civilian casualties, by how completely it achieved its goals. Reeves understood that wars weren't just fought with weapons, they were fought with perception, with discipline, with moral weight. And on that front, the Navy had held its line. He closed the file and looked out through the small window at the endless sea. The stars above the horizon shimmered faintly, their light reflected on the waves. Reeves exhaled slowly, the weight of command pressing on his shoulders. He had overseen countless missions in his career, but this one would be remembered. Not because it was the loudest, but because it was the clearest. A direct answer to months of provocation. A warning written not in words, but in precision-guided fire. In Yemen, local villagers near the coast awoke days later to the eerie quiet that followed the strike. For months they had lived with the constant hum of drones and the distant thump of missile launches from the Houthi base. Now, there was nothing. No trucks, no patrols, no soldiers. The valley was still smoking, its entrance collapsed, its roads blocked by rubble. What had once been a symbol of defiance was now a scar in the sand. The locals whispered among themselves that the Americans had erased the mountain itself. The global shipping industry responded almost immediately. Convoys of cargo ships began returning to their normal routes through the Red Sea. Insurance premiums dropped. The once anxious radio chatter between captains grew calm again. One British tanker captain, interviewed days later, said quietly, "You could feel it the moment you crossed those waters." The fear was gone. The sea felt safe again. But safety was never guaranteed, and the U.S. Navy knew it. Even as the Eisenhower strike group maintained its watch, radar systems stayed alert, scanning the skies for any sign of new drone activity. The memory of past attacks lingered, sharp and clear. One officer on the bridge summed it up perfectly: peace here isn't silence. Peace is the moment between two storms. Thousands of miles away, political circles debated the meaning of the strike. Some called it necessary. Others called it excessive. But few could deny that it had worked. For the first time in months, the Red Sea was quiet. Trade was moving. The threat was gone, at least for now. Meanwhile, among the Houthi fighters who survived, the mood had shifted from rage to fear. Many of them refused to return to the coastline, haunted by the memory of the explosions that tore through their base. Rumors spread of invisible jets and weapons that struck without warning, of eyes in the sky that saw everything. Psychological warfare, though unspoken, had done its job. The idea that the Americans could see them anywhere, at any time, was more powerful than any weapon. Back on the Eisenhower, evening settled in again. The deck glowed softly under the floodlights, and the ocean stretched into infinity. A group of pilots gathered near the railings, their flight suits unzipped halfway, helmets resting beside them. They spoke quietly about the mission, about the precision, the timing, the way everything unfolded perfectly. One of them, a young lieutenant, looked toward the stars and said, "It's strange, isn't it? You train your whole life for one night like that. And when it's over, it doesn't feel like victory. It just feels necessary." His words hung in the air for a moment. The others nodded silently. They understood. What they had done wasn't about glory. It was about restoring balance. In Washington, late-night meetings continued in the Pentagon's Situation Room. Analysts discussed how to maintain pressure without escalation, how to prevent another buildup of Houthi weapons. Satellite feeds showed scattered movements in other parts of Yemen, small groups, not organized, not threatening. For now, the message had worked. As days turned into weeks, the charred valley began to fade from headlines. The world's attention shifted elsewhere, to politics, to economics, to other flashpoints across the globe. But within the Navy, the operation became legend. Young recruits heard about it during training, whispered in the corridors as proof of what modern precision warfare could achieve. The phrase, "dropped the hammer," became a quiet badge of pride among the men and women who had been there that night. Months later, satellite photos captured something remarkable. The valley where the Houthi base once stood was almost unrecognizable. Sand had covered the ruins, erasing the outlines of bunkers and roads. Nature was reclaiming the land. Only the faint shapes of impact craters remained visible from above, like fingerprints pressed into the earth. The desert was silent again, but it would never forget. And somewhere far above, another Reaper drone flew silently across the same sky, its sensors scanning the terrain below, its operators alert and watching. The mission had ended, but the vigilance never would. The Navy's presence in those waters continued, not as conquerors, but as guardians of the fragile peace they had earned through strength. The U.S. Navy had dropped the hammer, and the world had seen the strike echo through the sand and the sea. But beyond the destruction lay a message that would outlast the smoke. Peace must be protected, not with words, but with resolve. As the sun set over the Gulf of Aden, the USS Eisenhower sailed steadily toward the horizon, her silhouette framed by gold and crimson light. The waves shimmered softly against her hull, and the sound of the ocean filled the air. On the flight deck, the flag fluttered gently in the wind. It wasn't a symbol of dominance. It was a reminder, of vigilance, of sacrifice, and of the balance that kept the world turning. The mission was over. The base was gone. The message was clear. No one challenges the ocean when the Navy stands watch.